You are standing at Porta San Gallo on a bright, warm April morning in the year 1490. Ahead, Florence rises in red roofs and pale stone, glowing softly in the early sun. Stay with us. In 15 minutes, you will see Medici Florence at its living peak. Behind you, the road is crowded with mule carts, pilgrims, and Flemish cloth traders. They have traveled for weeks to reach this city, because here, commerce rules all. Two guards in iron helmets check passes beneath Florence's red banner with the white lily. These walls have been expanded again and again as the city kept outgrowing them. Inside them live nearly 60,000 people, crowded into a city built for ambition. Horse dung, wood smoke, wet leather, and new bread strike you all in the same breath. You step through the gate and enter Via Larga, the broadest street in all Florence. It was widened on purpose, so Medici processions could pass in full theatrical splendor. Tall palaces line both sides, their pale stone facades cut clean and fitted with precision. Servants in red and white livery hurry between doorways carrying notes, books, and wine. A nobleman passes in a silk doublet, with fur at the collar and rings on both hands. His shoes taper into long points, a fashion Florence has admired for decades already. Children dart over the cobbles, while a woman leans from a window and calls below. Everything around you says the same thing. This city is rich, confident, and watching. Halfway along the street stands the Palazzo Medici, and it stops you instantly cold. Cosimo de' Medici began it in 1444, and his heirs finished it in rusticated stone. Its lowest level is rough and massive like a fortress. The upper floors grow smoother. The design is deliberate, masking immense power beneath a face of measured restraint. You pass the archway and enter a courtyard framed by columns in the antique Roman style. Bronze roundels gleam on the walls, inspired by gems and metals from the ancient world. Beyond them lies a private garden filled with marble torsos and citrus trees in rows. Young scholars sit in the shade, debating Plato, virtue, love, and the fate of states. Lorenzo de Medici hosts such gatherings often, turning conversation into a civic art. He's only 38, physically plain, politically brilliant, and feared across Italy. He governs no throne on paper, yet his influence bends trade, marriage, and diplomacy. Ambassadors from Milan, Naples, and Rome wait nearby, hoping for a word in private. Lorenzo supports a circle of scholars later called the Florentine Platonic Academy. Marsilio Ficino, translator of Plato, gives that circle its language and sacred urgency. At night, they read Greek aloud by torchlight, as if reviving voices long thought dead. Here, old medieval certainties loosen, and a new intellectual world begins to breathe. A boy named Michelangelo, just 15, has already entered the Medici orbit here. Lorenzo noticed him in a sculpture garden and brought him into the palace household. Right now, he sleeps under this roof, eats at this table, and absorbs everything he sees. You leave the palace and move southeast toward Florence's commercial and human center. The streets tighten as you go, becoming narrow stone canyons between very tall houses. Apprentices drag wool bales from warehouses, while hammer blows ring from an open forge. More than 70 banking houses operate within these walls at this very moment. The Medici Bank alone keeps branches in London, Bruges, Lyon, Rome, Naples, and Milan. Florentine credit reaches into wars, courts, monasteries, and royal treasuries abroad. Blue and white street markers are fixed high into the walls above passing heads below. Each district has its own patron saint, local loyalties, well, rivalries, and stories. Soon you enter the Mercato Vecchio, the market at Florence's old geographic center. A Roman column still rises here, a reminder that older worlds survive inside newer ones. Stalls display pepper from India, saffron from Abruzzo, and sugar from Sicilian cane. Spice merchants bargain in several languages before the morning sun reaches the square. Butchers hang carcasses from iron hooks above counters dark with blood and rendered fat. Nearby, an herbal seller arranges sage, lavender, mint, and dried medicinal roots. Notaries sit beneath awnings, drafting contracts, debts, dowries, and partnership terms. Men of the Wool Guild move through the crush with escorts, ledgers, and guarded purses. The wool trade underpins the city, employing thousands across looms, vats, and yards. Weavers, dyers, carders, and fullers labor in workshops scattered through nearby lanes. From toward the Arno comes the smell of indigo, sulfur, urine, and heated dye baths. A bell rings from above the market, marking the third hour of the Florentine morning. Turn east, and the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore rises above the rooftops like a planet. No description prepares you for it. Not rumor, not painting, not memory, not prayer. Brunelleschi finished the dome in 1436, and nothing else in Europe rivals its daring. It stands without the timber centering most builders thought absolutely necessary. The cathedral itself took 140 years from foundation to completion. Its skin is marble in white, green, and pink, drawn from quarries across Tuscany. You lean back in the piazza, and even the drum below the dome feels impossibly vast. Inside, the nave opens long and cool, stretching toward the altar in solemn shadow. Saints and prophets look down from painted surfaces lit by wavering candles and gold. The floor is set with geometric marble forms, as orderly as a mathematician's dream. Confraternities rehearse sacred drama near side chapels, their voices echoing softly. Few cities in Christendom gather so many churches into so small and crowded a space. Across the piazza stands the Baptistry of San Giovanni, older, lower, and deeply revered. Its octagonal shell is striped in white and dark green marble like ceremonial armor. Bronze doors by Ghiberti shimmer with biblical scenes cast in astonishing detail. Lorenzo himself called the east doors the gates of paradise, and the name remained. Every Florentine is baptized here, making this building both civic center and cradle. Inside, a vast golden Christ looks down from mosaics that glitter in half-lit space. Walk south a few minutes, and you emerge into the broad Piazza della Signoria at last. This is Florence's political heart, open, dusty, ceremonial, and quietly dangerous. The Palazzo della Signoria towers above one edge, severe as a warning made of stone. Its great tower climbs high above the square, watching roofs, bells, and distant hills. The governing council meets inside under guard, surrounded by ritual and legal form. Yet almost everyone knows the deepest decisions begin elsewhere, nearer Medici walls. Outside, the Marzocco lion stands as Florence's emblem, proud, alert, and possessive. Donatello's Judith still startles viewers, bronze violence frozen into civic meaning. Clusters of men debate Rome, Milan, taxes, grain, and the Ottoman threat to the east. A herald nails a proclamation to the door, and readers crowd close before the wax cools. Florence rests on 21 guilds, arranged by wealth, prestige, and political reach. The 7 major guilds dominate public life, law, finance, and access to office. 14 lesser guilds follow beneath them, from bakers and smiths to shoemakers. In this city, guild membership defines your rights, your network, and your standing. Near the square rises Orson Michele, once a grain market, now also a sacred place. Its outer niches hold statues commissioned by guilds competing in beauty and prestige. Donatello, Ghiberti, and Verrocchio have all left their marks upon these very walls. It is one of Florence's secrets, a world-class gallery built into a working street. Not far away, Verrocchio's workshop hums with apprentices shaping clay, wax, and bronze. Now walk south again, and you smell the Arno before the river comes fully into view. It runs broad and brown in spring, carrying snowmelt from the Apennines downstream. Ponte Vecchio crosses at a narrow point, crowded with butchers, stalls, and shouting. Their scraps and washwater often fall below, making the bridge rank even in a breeze. Birds wheel above the water, while porters thread through the crowd with hanging meat. In later years, a corridor will cross above, but in 1490, the sky still remains open. Eastward, you glimpse other bridges, stone spans linking trade, processions, and traffic. On the banks, laundresses beat clothing clean while tannery workers stain hides darker. Cross the bridge and the Oltrarno greets you with lower houses and harsher workshop smells. This side of the river feels more practical, more handmade, and closer to raw labor. Here live gilders, woodcarvers, joiners, sculptors, and makers of domestic splendor. Ghirlandaio's workshop works in this district, serving convents and elite households alike. Boys grind pigments by hand: lapis, ochre, lead white, verdigris, and red earth. Botticelli is still active this year, painting for patrons close to Lorenzo's circle. He lays tempera on panel with patient control, then sets delicate gold into the surface. Santa Spirito anchors the quarter, rebuilt on Brunelleschi's lucid and measured principles. Its plain exterior hides an interior shaped by proportion, clarity, and quiet balance. Farther south rises the unfinished mass of Palazzo Pitti, proud even in incompletion. Luca Pitti meant it to outshine the Medici, and the effort helped ruin his fortune. The Medici will buy it later, but for now it stands like ambition caught in stone. At the edge of the city, its huge blocks seem to challenge everyone passing nearby. Beyond it, the land lifts into the bobbly slopes, patterned with vines and olive groves. Peasants from the contado bring greens, eggs, wine, and beans toward the gates at dawn. Return within the walls and head northeast to the Franciscan vastness of Santa Croce. The piazza before it is enormous, used for festivals, jousts, sermons, and rough games. Calcio is played here with dozens of men aside, half sport and half ritualized battle. Each team stands for one city quarter, and bruises are accepted as part of the spectacle. Inside, wealthy families compete to endow chapels and secure burial close to holiness. The Pazzi Chapel, shaped by Brunelleschi, remains one of the city's purest spaces. The Pazzi name is cursed after the conspiracy of 1478, yet the chapel still survives. Its beauty proved stronger than politics, memory, vengeance, and official erasure. Near the Medici quarter stands San Marco, quiet outside and luminous with frescoes within. Fra Angelico painted the monks' cells with scenes of restraint, sorrow, and pale devotion. But a new voice has entered here. Girolamo Savonarola, fierce, severe, and unforgettable. He preaches against vanity, luxury, corruption, and the sins of a brilliant city. Crowds gather to hear him. Some tremble, some weep, and some leave inwardly changed. Even Lorenzo has listened, though he may not yet grasp what force has arrived here. Within a few years, Lorenzo will die, and Savonarola will dominate Florence's conscience. But in 1490, that future is still hidden beneath the glitter of Medici confidence. As evening approaches, Florence's light becomes exactly what painters later tried to keep. Pale stone warms to amber, while the dome above the roofs deepens slowly toward copper. Torches appear in the piazzas, and lute music drifts from taverns and private courtyards. Tonight, Lorenzo will host poetry, politics, and wit in the garden behind his palace. Poliziano may recite in Tuscan, the language that Dante helped raise into immortality. Cardinals, diplomats, scholars, and painters may share the same table before midnight. Florence believes itself the center of civilization, and many visitors think so too. In taverns near the market, men drink and argue in Latin, Greek, and local dialect. Now climb the Oltrarno hillside as the last light withdraws from roofs and river below. From here, the whole city spreads before you, red-roofed, walled, dense, and intensely alive. The great dome floats above it all, magnificent and improbable against the darkening sky. Then the bells begin, one tower first, then another, until the whole city answers. The Arno catches the final light and turns to gold for a moment before night takes it. You have walked through the most creative city in Europe at the height of its confidence. Within 10 years, Lorenzo will be dead, and the Medici will briefly lose the city. Savonarola will condemn luxuries and summon bonfires against the works this age adored. Yet what Florence creates in these years will outlive every faction, sermon, and exile. The dome will still stand, the bronze doors will still shine, the ideas will still travel. This is Florence in 1490. Brilliant, restless, vulnerable, and utterly unforgettable. Like and subscribe. Our next journey through the lost worlds of history begins soon.